When we connect speakers into a custom car audio system, it can be very handy to have a way to quickly disconnect them if need be. After all, when you take the stock speakers out of a vehicle, a lot of times they will have a stock little wiring harness that we can unplug. Being able to quickly disconnect a speaker is very important, and as an example, a lot of times aftermarket tweeters will have wired leads that are permanently attached to the tweeter like this. If this tweeter is mounted in something like an A-pillar or a custom speaker pod, when I go to remove this speaker from the vehicle, I don't want to have to pull that whole wire run out of the vehicle, or even worse, I don't want to have to cut the wire. We need an aftermarket means to quickly disconnect our speaker, and that's why I like using these connectors that I've reviewed here on the channel before. Now, what I love about these connectors is they can handle a ton of current, making them great for high power car audio applications. These are very strong and robust, and they have a hold that definitely does not come loose over time. Also, properly installed, I have a lot more faith in these not shorting out than I do the bullet style connectors, and there are some other reasons I don't trust those, as we will talk about later. But the issue I do have with these connectors that I've used in the past here on the channel is when I have an application that I need one of these to be rigidly mounted into something, and then the other one plugs into it. This is where I wish I had a mountable style connector, and in the past what I would do is I would just laser cut acrylic and I would use CA glue to attach one of these inside that piece and make my own. But obviously gluing these in place isn't really ideal, so it made me wonder, what if there is a mountable version? Now, obviously you guys have seen the thumbnail, and there is these guys right here. It took a little bit of searching, but I found these, and I'm going to teach you guys about them in this video. How do we solder our speaker wires to these, and how well do they work in a mounted position? Let's find out. Now, while we're on the topic of speaker wiring, it's important to remember that quality speaker wiring is a must for a high-end car audio system. So this is the perfect time to say a quick thank you to our monthly channel sponsor, New Concepts. One of my favorite speaker wire lines to use is from New Concepts, and it's the Karma speaker cable. Now, this wire not only comes in the typical 16 gauge, 14 gauge, and 12 gauge, it also comes in 10 gauge and this absolutely monstrous 8 gauge. No more using power wire as speaker wire for those really big SPL builds. You can use this instead. Even better yet, check this out. They also have a 12 gauge 4 conductor wire. This is perfect for those by-wire applications where you might have a set of component speakers that you need to wire to. To learn more about the New Concepts Karma series of wire, check out the link down in the video description. So on these mountable connectors, the first thing I notice is these seem to be just as robust as the other ones that I'm used to. As far as what I've seen available, when you buy these mountable connectors, they are all the female side of the connection. Now, of course, it's good to use the name brand ones, and of course those match up well, but I have found that some of the off-brand ones, which you can tell by this slightly different yellow color, these off-brand ones fit into the connector good as well and have a nice strong connection that's not easy to unplug, but not so strong that you can't unplug them when you want to. What I do like about the mountable side here, being the female side, is I feel like the pins are a little bit more exposed on this. So if you were mounting this into a pod or something that was going to be removed out of the vehicle, I find that that's beneficial because let's imagine that this male side here still has signal on it once you unplug this from the vehicle. I feel like with this male plug, we aren't as likely to possibly short out this connection to the amplifier, whereas this is a little bit more exposed. I like this male side usually being on the amplifier side a little bit better. A question that sometimes comes up when I do show you guys these connectors is why not just use the bullet style connector? I feel that those are kind of cheap and they do have a tendency to sometimes become disconnected over the lifetime of a vehicle just because they don't hold together as well. And the other nice advantage of these connections is you can see that the shape of the connector is made so that you can only plug this in one way. You can't plug it in like this right here. See how that shape is the wrong direction? You can only plug in one direction. And this is good because this makes sure that we connect our speaker in the correct polarity as long as we've soldered our connections correctly. We're going to have the right polarity no matter what when we go to disconnect this and plug it back in. There's no chance at making a mistake. So how do we solder our speaker wire to these? Let's say that we have a tweeter that is part of an A-pillar panel, and we want that A-pillar panel to be able to be removed along with the tweeter. That way we can service things if need be. And we're going to make a little mounting plate on the back side that's going to mount our connection that the speaker wire from the amplifier can plug into. First, we're going to prep the speaker wire by stripping away a small amount of the insulation. Before we forget, we want to add some heat shrink tubing over the wires because once we make these connections, we won't be able to put it on. Next, we want to connect the two half of our connections, and that's because when we heat these pins up to apply the solder, they can shift if they're not held in position. It's just a good idea to have the two attached. Now personally, I've found for my process that I like to use just a pair of vice grips like this to hold this in place while I'm doing all of this. You can use one of these devices for soldering, but this has a tendency to kind of move around more, whereas this really does not. That's why I like that more. I'm now going to tin each of the speaker leads. Basically, I'll heat up the speaker wire and then apply some solder so it starts to melt into the strands. I then tin each of the different connections on our connector. I hold the soldering iron underneath to heat up that pin and then apply the solder into this little bowl. Once both the wire and the pin are tinned, we can attach the two to each other by simply heating them up. Once everything is soldered and cooled down, we can push that heat shrink into place, protecting that wire, and we can shrink it down using a heat gun. I then put a final piece of oversized heat shrink tubing on each side, shrink that down as well, and now we have our prepared wiring. So the next step is actually mounting our connector. Now, since this connector is pretty small, when it comes to designing and making the piece that it's going to attach to, this is probably something that we're going to want to use a 3D printer or a CNC laser for. I think you could get away with making a hole for this connector by being real careful and using a Dremel tool, and then obviously drilling the two holes just using a normal drill and a drill bit. But for my example here, I'm going to cut a piece real quick on the laser using this 1/8 inch acrylic. So here's my plate that I cut out on the laser, and if it helps you guys out, I'll put some of the dimensions that I used for the cutout here on screen. That way, if you're 3D printing this or cutting it on a laser yourself, you can copy those dimensions and make these cuts. Now when I bought these, screws were included, which is good because the little nuts that are inside the connector are metric threaded, so we definitely want to make sure we have the right threads for our Allen screws. And just in case you were curious, to mount this in, it used a 1.5mm Allen key. So here we have it, our mounted speaker connector. Now obviously this could be the outside of a speaker pod. It could be something that we attach inside of a door panel. That way it's nice and rigid mounted and we don't have to worry about these connectors vibrating when the speakers are moving. Lots of different options depending on how you fabricate into your install. As far as attaching the two together goes, those screws are just enough outside that they don't get into the way. And this is basically what I've come to expect from the connections here, nice and robust mounting. So this is really a good solution to keep things nice and clean depending on how you're using this in your install. So I am definitely planning on stocking a bunch of these to have them on hand for future installs. If you want to stock up and get your own, definitely check out the links down in the video description. And don't forget to check out New Concepts and their Karma series speaker cable. If you guys want to learn more, they're down there as well. A big thanks to them, along with Bart, Mike, Ali, Jerry, Marcos, William, and the rest of the Patreon membership team. A big thanks to all those guys for making these videos possible, and thank you for watching.